The Story of Steam, Part 2, Steam Locomotives. Welcome to Part 2 of The Story of Steam. In Part 1 I covered the steam engines of the early Industrial Revolution. The engines of Thomas Newcomen and James Watt used low-pressure steam. Steam locomotives use high-pressure steam. And here in Part 2 of The Story of Steam I cover the development of steam locomotives. James Watt and high-pressure steam. James Watt is often described as the father of the steam engine. Certainly stationary steam engines of his design powered the factories of the Industrial Revolution. But, surprisingly, James Watt had nothing to do with the development of the steam locomotive. James Watt's engines used low-pressure steam. Steam was vented into a sealed cylinder with a piston at its top. The steam pushed out the air in the cylinder, and the steam itself was then vented out into a separate condenser, creating a vacuum in the cylinder which drew the piston down, driving a flywheel and then the machinery attached to the engine. Finally, the flywheel would lift the piston back to the top of the cylinder and the cycle would start again. James Watt was opposed to the use of high-pressure steam because he felt it was unsafe. The engineering and metalworking standards of the time meant that the joints and the pipes would frequently burst where high-pressure steam was used. However, one of Boulton and Watt's employees, William Murdoch, would take the science of high-pressure steam forward. William Murdoch. William Murdoch was born in Ayrshire in Scotland. In 1777, at the age of 23, he walked from Scotland to Birmingham, a distance of 300 miles, to ask James Watt for a job at the Boulton and Watt factory. Murdoch's skills were quickly recognised and he became an important member of the team. In 1779, Murdoch became the company's representative in Cornwall and supervised the erection and maintenance of the steam engines built in the area. Since the company was paid a royalty based on the efficiency of the engines, his work was vital to the success of the business, and he was very good at it. Murdoch made suggestions for the improvement of the steam engines and contributed to several of the company's patents. There's evidence to suggest that the Sun and Planet gear, patented by James Watt in 1781, was actually invented by William Murdoch. In 1799, Murdoch patented under his own name a precursor of the steam turbine. He also developed the world's first pneumatic tube message system of the type still seen in some businesses. William Murdoch was interested in high-pressure steam for many years. James Watt, distrustful of high-pressure steam, tried to discourage his schemes. In 1784, Murdoch made a working model of a steam carriage. He built more models, improving their design, throughout the 1780s, although his employers did not support this work. Some evidence suggests that he built a full-sized steam carriage in the 1790s. During that time, Richard Trafithik lived next door to Murdoch in Redruth in Cornwall. Trafithik certainly knew of Murdoch's experiments and may have helped him during this time. Murdoch does not seem to have done any further work in high-pressure steam, although Trafithik took his ideas forward. Although his name is little known today, William Murdoch was pivotal in the development of the Industrial Revolution. As well as making substantial improvements to James Watt's steam engines and advancing the concept of steam locomotion, he also made other important advances, including in dyes. He created a cheaper form of isinglass for the brewing industry, and he was instrumental in the development of gas lighting. The first factory in the world to be fully lit by gas was a cotton mill in Manchester. The system was installed by Murdoch in 1805. However, Murdoch failed to apply for a patent for his gas lighting, and the Boulton and Watt company didn't fully capitalise on his work, leaving other businesses to benefit from the massive expansion of gas lighting in factories and towns in the early part of the 19th century. From around 1818, William Murdoch developed a marine engineering branch of Boulton and Watt, equipping up to 60 vessels with steam engines. He retired from the business in 1830 and died in 1839. Richard Trevithick. It is Richard Trafithik who deserves the credit as the inventor of the steam locomotive. Born at Redruth in Cornwall in 1771, Trafithik was fascinated by the steam pumping engines he saw at mines in the area. He became aware of William Murdoch and lived next door to him in Redruth in the later part of the 1790s. Richard Trafithik became a mining engineer in 1797 and worked with Edward Bull to develop a new type of steam pumping engine, which was later found to infringe Boulton & Watt's patents. By that time metalworking standards had improved, and Trafithik dared to experiment with high-pressure steam. He made models in the late 1790s and built his first full-sized engine around 1799. Although less efficient than Watt's engines, Trafithik's high-pressure boilers were smaller and easier to install and used less water. Engines to his design began to be installed to pump water or drive machinery from the early 1800s. The firm of Boulton & Watt continued to shun the construction of high-pressure engines. Richard Trafithik's most important contribution is to steam locomotion. He mounted one of his boilers on a carriage in 1801 and demonstrated it in the village of Camborne in Cornwall. The heavy steam carriage was soon damaged by the rutted roads. Undeterred, however, Richard Trafithik patented his steam engine in 1802 and built another steam carriage in London, where he took passengers from Paddington to Holborn, a distance of about 4 miles. The carriage was expensive to run, and the project was soon abandoned. However, the idea of steam locomotion had been introduced to the public. In 1804, one of Trafithik's stationary pumping engines exploded, killing 4 men. As a result, Trafithik developed safety valves for his engines. The state of the roads in early 19th century England meant that steam carriages were not a practical proposition, and Trafithik turned his attention to running a steam locomotive on rails. In 1804, Richard Trafithik became the first person in the world to build a steam locomotive. With it, he won a £500 bet by hauling 10 tons of iron ore and 70 men 10 miles along iron rails in South Wales. This first train in the world ran at an average speed of 2.5 miles per hour. A second engine was built, and Trafithik set up a circular track near Euston Road in London in 1808. He called the locomotive Catch Me Who Can and charged visitors 1 shilling for a ride. However, the rails broke under the weight of the engine and public interest waned. Trafithik's problem was that cast iron rails were too brittle for the heavy steam engines. The quality of rails would not improve until the late 1820s. Richard Trafithik built no further locomotives after his failure in London, although he did work on many other engineering projects, including new designs of stationary high-pressure engines. He died penniless in 1833 and was buried in an unmarked grave in London. Richard Trafithik built the world's first steam locomotive and demonstrated its potential. His ideas stimulated others and started the railway revolution of the 19th century. John Blankensop. John Blankensop is little known today, but made an important contribution to steam locomotion. In 1812, Blankensop built a rack and pinion railway at Middleton Colliery near Leeds in England. His locomotive weighed 5 tons and regularly hauled trains of 90 tons of coal. Similar locomotives were built for collieries near Wigan and for collieries near Newcastle upon Tyne. It was the locomotive sent to Newcastle that would influence the next generation of engine builders. William Headley. William Headley was born in 1779 and became a manager at Willem Colliery near Newcastle upon Tyne. He was interested in steam locomotion and knew of Blankensop's rack and pinion engines, but he believed they were too complex and expensive to be practical. Headley built a locomotive to Richard Trafithik's design in 1812, but it did not work well. He then incorporated elements of John Blankensop's design to build the famous Puffing Billy in 1813. This was followed by a second locomotive called Willem Dilly. Both engines remained in service until 1862. William Headley built the first practical and reliable steam locomotives, but it was George Stephenson who would take up his ideas and conquer the world with them. George Stephenson. George Stephenson was born at Wilham, 9 miles west of Newcastle upon Tyne, in 1781. He worked at Wilham Colliery under William Headley. His parents were very poor, and George was illiterate until the age of 18. George Stephenson married in 1802, although his wife sadly died in 1806, when their son Robert was 3 years old. Working at the collieries around Killingworth near Durham, George Stephenson became an expert in the steam engines that operated there. He designed his first locomotive in 1814, and it could haul 30 tons of coal at 4 miles per hour. Stevenson built up to 16 locomotives for the collieries around Killingworth. In 1817 he supplied a locomotive to the Kilmarnock and Troon Railway, the first railway in Scotland to use a steam locomotive. However, the engine damaged the track and was withdrawn. It was the poor quality of cast iron rails that hindered the development of the steam locomotive at that time, but wrought iron rails began to be used in the 1820s. Assisted by his son Robert, George Stephenson was hired to build the Hetton Colliery Railway, which was completed in 1822, and was the first railway in the world to operate entirely with steam traction. The line was 8 miles long and worked by 5 Stephenson-built locomotives, with 2 sections of rope-hauled inclined plane, operated by stationary steam engines. The owners of Hetton Colliery were not satisfied with George Stephenson's work, and he was dismissed in 1823. But better things would come for him. The Stockton and Darlington Railway. There were rich coalfields around the town of Darlington in County Durham, but road transport was slow and expensive, and the nearest port was Stockton-on-Tees, 12 miles away. A canal had been proposed as early as 1810, but opposition from local landowners meant that none was built. In 1818 a tramway was proposed, but the planned route was opposed. A new route was surveyed and finally agreed, and the Stockton and Darlington Railway Act was passed by Parliament in 1821. There was no mention in it of steam locomotives. An early documentation suggested that wagons would be hauled by horses. George Stephenson was elected engineer for the line in January 1822, and he suggested the use of steam locomotives, as well as a slightly shorter and easier route. This was approved the following year. George Stephenson used malleable iron rails in the construction, rather than the fragile cast iron. He also designed an iron bridge for the route. George's son Robert established the world's first locomotive works in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1823 and was commissioned to build 4 locomotives for the line. The Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in 1825 and drew vast crowds to see it in operation. The line was intended to transport coal and became highly profitable. Passenger operations also started in 1825, and around 40,000 passengers were carried on the line between 1826 and 1827. The Stockton and Darlington Railway was the first steam-hauled public railway in the world. This was the dawn of the railway age. The first public railway in Scotland was the Monkland and Kirkintilloch Railway near Glasgow, which opened in 1826, but which didn't move to steam locomotion until 1831. The first public railway in the United States was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which employed the first steam locomotive built in the US, called Tom Thumb, in 1829. This was a demonstration engine not used to haul public trains. The first operational locomotive was the Grasshopper in 1832. The Rainhill Trials. After his success with the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and then the Bolton and Lee Railway opened in 1828, George Stephenson was appointed principal engineer for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which was to be the first intercity railway in the world. The route featured a number of gradients, and the directors of the railway were not sure that steam locomotives would be suitable. The Rainhill trials were organised to test the abilities of the steam engines of the time. Rainhill was the steepest section of the line. 5 locomotives took part on the day, and 2 of those were withdrawn. George and Robert Stevenson designed a new type of locomotive for the trials, the famous Rocket, which proved vastly better than the other engines, reaching 24 miles per hour on one of its runs. In the days following the trials, the Rocket took trains of 40 passengers up and down part of the route as a PR exercise to convince the local population. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway Company ordered 6 locomotives from Robert Stephenson and Company, engine builders, and the line officially opened in September 1830. It was hugely popular and highly profitable. The railway age had arrived, and the period called Railway Mania was about to begin. But that's a story for part 3 of the story of steam. Come back for part 3, the story of Railway Mania and later developments in steam power.